Hello, this is Professor Bustillo-Booth, and this is part 2 of our wrap-up for weeks 1 and 2. In the previous segment, we discussed the onboarding steps, the orientation to class platforms, that we had a discussion, let's talk, and then we began to discuss the main concepts around Chapter 1, the dynamics of business and economics. And we will finish off here with our discussion around globalization, trade, and jobs, as well as why we study business. So we'll pick up at supply and demand. And so what you're seeing here is a demand curve. And demand is defined as the number of goods and services consumers are willing to buy at different prices at a specific time. And so as you see here, you'll find that on the y-axis is price, the x-axis is quantity. And as the price goes down, the quantity demanded increases. So at P, the quantity demanded was A. At P, here's the point on the demand curve, and the quantity demanded was Q. And then when the price went down, P1, down the demand curve, and an increase in quantity, as you see here on the x-axis. Okay, and then the supply curve, which is its counterpart, and it means the number of products that the businesses are willing to sell at different prices at a specific time. And not surprisingly, as the price goes up, more of that quantity is supplied. And the interaction between these two curves is, as you can see here, where the curves meet, in this case A, is called the equilibrium. And criticisms on the study of economics is around that the economic system does not distribute resources equally. And so, for example, the rich can always access goods and resources at high prices while the poor cannot. And so it may not be a good economic model to sort of aspire to. And so people are always looking for a different economic model. And one economic model may be one where accounting for certain inputs and outputs that are not currently being accounted for. For example, in the classical economic model, pollution is not part of the equation. It is regarded as what's called an externality. And so therefore, it's external to the equation, external to the discussion, even though it really does have costs. So whether or not that's accounted for in the model, there is cost to pollution, and somebody has to bear it. Society has to bear it. And so a criticism of the model is this. All right. And then if you want to learn more about econ or economics, I highly recommend you at the very least take Econ 101, which is a survey of microeconomics and macroeconomics. So little picture, big picture there. If you want to dive a little further, especially if you're really serious about business, you'll want to make sure you understand sort of the economic model and greater forces. All right, so the nature of competition, not surprisingly, is about rivalry, and that the theory is that competition improves quality and eventually will reduce prices. And that in our system, there are 4 types. Your book goes through this fairly well, so I won't go over it too much here. But there's pure competition, where small businesses sell standardized products. Monopolistic competition, where only a few businesses sell the same product to satisfy the same consumer need. I think about aspirin. There's only so many ways you can make aspirin, but it does satisfy the same consumer need, right? Oligopoly, oli meaning few, that's where few businesses sell product and control the prices. Think about airline tickets. There are only few airlines, as opposed to many retailers, right? But there are only a few airlines selling, airline tickets to get you to places, and they do control the prices. And then the idea of monopoly, mono, one, single. It's one business that provides a product in a market. All right, so then there's economic cycles and productivity. And in the business world, it's highly accepted that there are cycles, that economies expand and contract. So a period of expansion is a period of economic growth where people spend more and more. But the danger, of course, for any kind of expansion, if it expands too fast, is that there's inflation. continuing rise in prices. And the contraction is the idea where spending declines. People kind of withhold their money, and they lose confidence in the economy, and so they don't feed the economic engine through their purchases, and then there's economic decline. And the danger is that if it's sustained year over year, we have what's called a recession, and that then it results in decline production, unemployment rates then go up, and then incomes also can go down or stagnate. And there's a downward spiral effect of that, so when people stop spending, demand decline, the growth declines, unemployment increases, and then which means spending declines, and then more declines for demand, and so on. So we want to try to avoid that, and there are public policies that try to keep that from happening. All right, so the American economy in brief is that we started out as an agricultural economy, very self-sufficient, and we produced what was needed because we had a lot of resources, and we still do. This is a very resource-rich country. And however, colonization brought some manufactured goods, and so Great Britain and its kingdom basically provide us with goods. And as our nation expanded westward, we found more natural resources like coal, copper, and iron, which we had to do something with, right? So we produced goods with them. So our railways, our buildings, and the like. And concurrently what's happening is the Industrial Revolution, which brought about new technologies, and these new technologies brought together the materials, say, for example, the copper, the iron, the machines that made the copper, the irons, and the workers who then had to, handle the machines and the materials. And then a little bit on the industrialization led to prosperity. So our agricultural culture sort of shifted into a manufacturing one, and which gave rise to assembly lines, and which is really a kind of efficiency innovation, which brought about more jobs to the cities. And with more jobs to the cities, there were more people with income, and so they demanded more goods because they had more money to spend. And so the manufacturing economy, fast forward a little bit in our history, gave rise to the marketing economy. And that's when we produced so much stuff that people had so much choice that businesses actually had to differentiate themselves from other businesses and had to start undergoing sort of research as to what people really needed, so that they could offer them, sort of meet their need, as opposed to, oh, we're just going to build this, and so people want it because nobody ever had it before. And now people had choice and had many of them, and so businesses had to really think about how to communicate, create, and capture that value to satisfy consumers' needs. After World War II, there was great prosperity. So this is economic expansion. People had more time and more money, and so it increased our better standard of living, and also more women in the workforce, right? And even when the men came back from the war, some of the women stayed in the workforce, which led to slower population growth, and there was also concurrent increase in immigration, which we needed really to sort of support the economic structure. And so along with that were changes in the family dynamics. So there were more single parent families, individuals living alone, and those who had two-parent families, both parents worked. And so Americans basically became very busy people. They were time-pressed. And as we marched through generations, we started looking for services to do the work that we normally had done, because, we're no longer home, we're working. And so we started to look for people who would do our cooking. And so that's where, frozen foods came in, and then laundry. Have washer dryers, but we also have laundry services, and we send our children to childcare. And a little fast forward, we now have online education services to manage our own time, because it's really difficult, to necessarily go to school during the daytime if you're working. So many of you know what that's like. Okay, so today our demand for some services have only increased, not just by individuals, but businesses too. And that services account for 80% of the U.S. economy. That's a huge number, 80% of the U.S. economy. And that Our services, because it's largely competitive, not just internal to our borders, but outside of our borders, internal meaning business to business competition, or even services outside of our borders. So international trade, so for example, because we do trade in services, we're looking for ways to maintain our edge through sustaining and efficiency innovations. I won't have time to talk very much about the difference between these two, but just suffice it to say, sustaining is about creating a better product. Efficiency is about reducing the cost of production. Okay. So that's where automations come in. So innovations today, we would think of them largely from the digitization aspect. So anything that can be sort of programmed and automated is in the digitization age. And we've seen it manifested in e-commerce. Most of us have bought something online, so that's e-commerce. And then there are digital goods and services, intangible and otherwise. For example, most of us walk around with a smartphone. That is a tangible product, but it has intangible services in there. There are apps in there, there are calendars in there, there's, there are ways for us to manage our life in there. Banking is in there. Banking is an intangible service. So that's an innovation from the digital age. All right, so a little bit about automation, robots, and jobs, because we talked about that, and I really enjoyed reading your thoughts about it. So let me just offer a little bit of mine, which is largely, many of you have already touched on this, but it's good to have a common language and a common understanding as a learning community. And so one of the reasons that businesses seek automation or robots is because they want to maintain their edge in a competitive field through productivity gains, so doing more with less time, and they gain that from automation and information technologies, and they basically help them retain or enhance the global competitiveness, not just here, because other countries are seeking the same innovations. Our competitiveness is not limited to our own borders. All right, this is interesting though. In this sort of age of automation, 38% of U.S. jobs are at risk of being replaced by robots, artificial intelligence, also known as AI, over the next 15 years. Only 30, it's still a large number, but 30, significantly less, of the United Kingdom jobs are similarly endangered, and 21% of Japanese jobs face the same risk. You have to start asking yourself, why the disparity, right? Because the jobs in the US and the UK are around the similar services in key sectors. So what are we talking about? Key sectors. So finance, transportation, education, manufacturing, and food services. What's the difference is the nature of the work done is different. And so let's use financial services as an example to help understand why this might be the case. So 61% of US jobs are at risk of being replaced by robots in the financial services sector, while only half of that, 32% of UK jobs, are similarly endangered. What's the reason? The reason is that the US is focused on domestic retail operations. Think bank tellers in small towns. Okay. In the UK, the people in that sector, in the financial service sector, are focused on international finance, investment banking, which requires significantly higher levels of education and expertise. So the US jobs do more routine tasks. They're far easier to automate than that of, say, an investment banker in London or, other places in the world. Those are just higher skilled jobs that require higher levels of critical thinking and exercise a higher degree of judgment. Very difficult to automate. Okay. And so there are business implications as well as public policy implications. And a lot of my background is in, sort of where the public and the private sector intersect. And so here are some questions I offer you to ask as you begin to listen to the news or read about globalization, automation, and how it's affecting jobs. So, because as a society, we're going to have to start asking these kinds of questions. I don't necessarily have answers, but the questions are important. So one of which is, at what point are efficiency gains from automation cannibalistic, sort of eat up our private and public bottom lines, right? Or do we just sort of blindly go forward without understanding how it is that we really are either consciously or unconsciously creating our own fates? What public policy initiatives need to be considered to balance efficiency, innovation, and job creation? And when I think public policy initiatives, this has very much to do with a collaboration with the private sector, because you can't do this just with public policy. It will be highly resisted. So both of those sectors will have to talk, the private and the public. So what is balance and what are the rules of the game? The new rules of the game. What role do trade organizations like the World Trade Organization play in promoting world prosperity in a digital age? So that, so the idea there is that, the WTO is really to sort of lift all boats up, right? But is that really what's happening? And what do trade organizations, what are their role in making sure that happens? And then in a trade-dependent world, and this will become more interesting for us to discuss in Chapter 3, what role should free trade agreements, FTAs, play in addressing economic, political, social, environmental interests? Those are really important questions to ask, because the world doesn't just play on the economic field. There are political, social, and increasingly environmental interests as well. I will not necessarily go over much of the entrepreneurial aspect here, other than to say that entrepreneurs risk wealth, time, and effort for profitable gain. And they are into innovations, whether it's a product or a way of doing something, and that in order for them to play on this field, they have to sort of act within a free enterprise system. Otherwise, they're not entrepreneurs. And that if you want to learn more about this, a small business planning, for example, a class on Management 284 will go over the 5 C's concept, which is like your shtick in the marketplace, understanding your competition, your customers, what kind of skill sets you need in order to be successful, and how to get your cash, as well as the 5 keys of business. What is your differentiating value proposition, how it is you make your money, that's your business model, how you get your first customer, how you make your first million, and ultimately the consideration of an exit strategy. And so why we study business, and in large part because it is really the engine of our economy, of which small businesses make up the vast majority of the economy. 28.8 million businesses are small businesses. 99.7% of the U.S. employer firms are small businesses. That's almost 100%. And 56.7 million small businesses, employees, and that make up 48% of all U.S. employees. So that's a good half of our workforce. And that U.S. exporters, of those, 97.7 are small businesses. And so, firms and that less than 100 employees have the largest share of small business employment. So, that's really important to understand the impact of business in as a whole, and really not just to study business, but to study small businesses, right? Because what happens at the macro level impacts the small businesses the most, therefore the U.S. economy, right? So macro level being the larger forces at play. And so also big business principles are largely the same for small businesses. So the legal formation questions, options are, largely the same, although some of those legal formation options are not necessarily exercised by small business until they get to be bigger, right? And then they both have to manage quality, understand their competition. They have to manage their human resources. They have to exercise marketing principles. They have to understand the financing of their resources so they can be profitable. For our next topics during weeks 3 and 4, we'll be covering ethics and responsibility, and that is a fascinating topic. How we do right as we make money, as businesses make money, and that the legal thing may not always be the ethical thing. So those are interesting concepts to dive into. And we will also be going over the idea and reality of a borderless world. I want to thank you for listening in on these wrap-ups, and I hope that you've taken good notes so that you can go ahead and take the wrap-up quiz. And I want to wish you good luck on that, and we'll talk with you again soon.